The sun was dying slow that evening, stretching its last gold fingers across the dust like a man reaching for mercy. The sky above the plains burned orange and bruised, the kind of sky that looks too beautiful to belong to a world so cruel. And down the long dirt road that led through the town of Marlow Ridge, a woman walked alone. Her dress was torn at the hem, frayed by the wind. Her boots had lost their shine long ago, and the dust clung to her like sorrow that refused to let go. But her back was straight, her steps steady. People watched from behind wooden shutters, whispering, "That's the widow from the edge of town, the one whose husband died digging for silver, the one the sheriff robbed blind with false taxes and hollow laws." No one spoke to her. No one stopped her. They all just watched her pass, the same way they might watch a candle burn down to nothing. By the time she reached the edge of town, the world had gone still. The sound of a single crow broke the silence as she turned down a dry trail that bled into the desert. The horizon shimmered, not from beauty, but heat. She walked without fear, though her heart trembled like a foal learning to stand. In the folds of her memory, the sound of her brother's cough echoed. He was barely 13, lungs eaten by the mine dust their father once worked in. Her mother's hands shook as she spooned water from a tin bowl, whispering prayers that the Lord must have long stopped hearing. Then came the men, 3 of them, wearing the badge of law but hearts of wolves. They told her the farm was no longer theirs, that her family had 3 days to leave, or they'd burn the place down. And behind their words, she saw the smirk of the sheriff himself, a man who hid his greed behind scripture and whiskey. She had begged once. She had cried once. But the world had no ear for women's tears. So she learned silence, and silence became her weapon. That morning, she'd overheard the men talk about the outlaw camp beyond the canyon, led by Cole West, the kind of name that traveled on the wind like a curse. A man said to rob trains, steal cattle, and shoot only when he had to, which made him, in her eyes, less dangerous than the sheriff who smiled when he destroyed lives. And so, when the night fell and the wind rose, she made her choice. No one saw her leave. She wrote a note to her mother, a single line. "Forgive me. I'll bring peace in my own way." Then she walked into the darkness. By the time she reached their camp, the moon had risen high, pale as a scar. The fire in the distance flickered like a signal from another world. The men saw her first. Rough voices rose in disbelief. A woman walking straight into the outlaw camp, alone, unarmed, unshaken. They surrounded her, laughter cutting through the night. One called out something crude, another spat in the dust near her feet. But she didn't flinch. Her voice came quiet, like a prayer carried by wind. "I'm here for Cole West." That silenced them. A tall figure stepped forward from the shadows, coat brushing the dust, eyes half hidden under a hat rimmed with trailed dust. He didn't look like the devil they described, more like a man who'd long stopped expecting goodness from the world. His face was carved and quiet, and when he spoke, his voice was the low rumble of distant thunder. "You must be lost, ma'am. This isn't a place for hope." Her eyes met his. There was no fear there, only exhaustion, and something that looked like resolve wearing the mask of calm. "I'm not lost. I came to offer myself as your prisoner." The men around them burst into laughter again. But Cole didn't laugh. He just tilted his head, studying her as if trying to see whether she was flesh or ghost. "And why would a woman do a thing like that?" "Because the sheriff wants to burn my family alive for debts we never owed. And they say you're the only man he fears." For a long time, he said nothing. The fire cracked and hissed. A dry wind lifted strands of her hair, setting them free like whispers. Finally, he spoke again, low and grave. "You're asking a devil to play the savior. I'm asking a man to remember he still has a soul." Something flickered in his eyes then, a shadow of memory, maybe pain. He stepped closer, his boots heavy in the sand. The firelight caught his face. A scar ran from his jaw to his neck, like lightning frozen in flesh. He reached out and took the rope hanging from his saddle, tossing it at her feet. "You sure you want to wear this kind of mercy?" Without looking away, she picked it up and placed it in his hands. "Do what you must. Just don't let them die." A silence fell over the camp that even the wind dared not break. Cole's men looked from one to another, uncertain whether to mock or to admire. But the man himself simply turned away, muttering, "Get her a place by the fire. She stays for now." That night, she sat by the flames, wrapped in an old blanket someone tossed her way. She didn't sleep. The desert hummed with sounds that weren't quite alive. The rattle of the wind, the creak of leather, the shifting of men who didn't know what to make of a woman like her. Cole sat across from her, cleaning his gun with slow, steady movements. Now and then his gaze lifted, meeting hers. No words passed, but something unspoken began to form, the kind of fragile respect born between two souls who have both walked through fire. She thought of her mother's hands, of her brother's cough, of the price she'd just offered. And in that quiet, something inside her whispered, "So this is what courage feels like. It doesn't roar. It barely breathes." When dawn came, the horizon blushed pale pink over the ridges. The men began to stir, muttering, cooking, preparing their horses. She rose and walked toward the edge of camp, feeling the first warmth of morning on her skin. Cole stood by his horse, saddle strapped, hat low. He turned when he sensed her behind him. "You still mean to stay? Until my family's safe." He gave a slow nod. "Then you ride with us. Keep close, don't speak, don't run. You'll live longer that way. And if I don't?" He met her eyes, something almost like amusement ghosting through the hardness there. "Then you'll prove you've got more steel than half the men here." He mounted up, motioned for her to follow. One of the outlaws offered her a small mare, bony, stubborn, but kind-eyed. She climbed on without hesitation. As the camp broke apart, they rode out toward the open land, the sun climbing behind them like a promise that didn't quite dare to shine. Dust rose in swirls, catching the morning light. No one spoke. She looked back once, toward the distant shape of home, where the smoke from their chimney rose faint and thin against the horizon. She whispered under her breath, "Hold on, Mama, hold on." Cole rode beside her, silent. Every few moments, his gaze flicked her way, not with ownership, not with pity, but with the quiet curiosity of a man who's just seen a miracle and doesn't yet know what to call it. By the time the sun burned high, their shadows stretched long across the plain. The world around them was endless. No walls, no mercy, no witnesses. Only two souls riding toward an uncertain salvation. The silence between them was its own kind of music, heavy, slow, but alive. And somewhere inside that silence, she felt the faint pulse of something unfamiliar. Not fear, not hope, something in between, the space where both can live holding hands. As the trail dipped into the canyon and the sky deepened from gold to indigo, she knew there was no turning back. Whatever she had been, widow, daughter, desperate soul, was behind her now. What lay ahead was a story she could not yet name. That night, the stars watched in quiet judgment as we rode beneath them. He said nothing. I said nothing. But in the stillness, I felt something break and rebuild inside me, like a chain turning into a prayer. The world had taken everything from me, and still, I was not done fighting. Not yet. The days that followed bled one into another, long and dust-colored. They rode through canyons shaped by time and wind, the earth cracked and ancient, the kind of land that remembered everything and forgave nothing. To her surprise, no one tied her wrists. No one called her slave or toy. She rode among them, silent, unclaimed, like a ghost who'd chosen to walk beside the living. Cole West said little. When he did, it was in few words, plain as gravel. But every order he gave was fair, and every punishment measured. Even in lawlessness, he kept a strange sort of order, as if the wild itself obeyed him. Their camp sat deep in the valley, where a river curved like a silver vein through the red stone. At night, the firelight painted the faces of men who'd once been farmers, soldiers, drifters. None of them were saints, but few were monsters either. The West made its own kind of man, one the world had forgotten how to understand. She watched them play cards, tell stories, laugh at memories that weren't funny. When one was wounded, she brought water. When they were hungry, she helped cook. At first, they mocked her, called her Miss Prisoner, the widow, the brave fool. But her quiet endurance began to dull their cruelty. One evening, as the wind howled through the canyon, one of the younger outlaws said, "She don't flinch no more. Even the desert's learning her ways." The others laughed, but there was something almost soft in their laughter, like respect hiding in rough voices. Cole sat apart from them, always. A man carved from silence. Sometimes he'd watch the horizon instead of the fire, as if expecting it to speak. Sometimes he'd carve small figures from driftwood, horses, hawks, a lone woman with no face. He never explained why. She wanted to ask about his scars, the long one on his jaw, the faint burn along his wrist. But something in his stillness told her that questions were doors not meant to be opened just yet. Instead, she watched and listened to his voice, deep and steady like river stone, to the way he gave orders without cruelty, to the way he checked his men's rifles not for dominance, but for safety. She began to see the truth of it. He wasn't a man who enjoyed power. He was a man who carried it because no one else could. One night, after a week on the trail, the rain came. Cold, unmerciful rain that turned the desert floor into slick clay and soaked them to the bone. They huddled under a ledge, fire sputtering, horses restless. The men grumbled, but Cole only tightened his coat and said, "We wait it out." She sat a few feet away, shivering. Her blanket was drenched. He noticed. Without a word, he pulled his from his shoulders and tossed it toward her. She caught it, surprised. He didn't look back. But when the thunder cracked, his hand twitched, a small, almost invisible sign of someone who had known storms far worse than this. That night, she whispered softly to herself, not prayer but gratitude. He pretended not to hear. But when morning came, there was an extra cup of coffee waiting near her saddle. Days turned to weeks. The line between prisoner and companion blurred, smudged by shared miles and silent understanding. She began to see his kindness not in what he said, but in what he restrained. When a man mocked her, Cole's glance alone was enough to silence him. When they ran low on food, he gave her his portion. No grand gestures, no declarations, just steady, quiet choices that slowly built a bridge she hadn't expected to find. Late one night, when most of the men had fallen asleep, she woke to the faint sound of music. A harmonica, low, uneven, the tune bending like a wounded thing trying to remember how to fly. She followed the sound and found him sitting alone by the dying fire, the sky above vast and filled with restless stars. He didn't stop playing when he saw her, didn't ask her to leave, just let the music fill the air between them, the kind that speaks when words would only bruise the moment. When he finished, the silence that followed felt sacred. She sat across from him, drawing her knees close, watching the smoke rise and twist into the dark. He spoke then, voice low, almost hesitant. "I used to play for my brother. Before the war took him. Before the law took what was left of me." The confession hung between them, raw and human. She didn't answer, just looked at him, eyes reflecting the firelight. Sometimes words aren't needed to say, "I understand." He looked away, lips tightening. "Don't mistake me for something I'm not. The world calls me an outlaw, for good reason." Her reply came soft, steady. "The world calls anyone an outlaw who refuses to kneel." He stared at her for a long time after that, and something changed in his gaze. The hardness softened, the distance narrowed. The days after grew gentler. Small gestures became language. When she laughed, truly laughed, for the first time in years, he stopped what he was doing and just listened, like a man hearing rain after a long drought. The men noticed, teased him, but even they seemed to soften in her presence. The camp that once reeked of lawlessness began to feel like something else, a place that almost felt like home. Then came the fever. It struck fast. One day she was strong, the next she could barely sit up. The desert sun burned her skin, her lips cracked, her voice turned to whispers. She dreamed of her mother's face, her brother's laughter, the sound of wind through dry wheat. When she opened her eyes, the world swam in light and shadow. Cole was there, sitting beside her, a wet cloth pressed against her brow. He didn't speak, didn't sleep. For 3 nights, he stayed. Once, half dreaming, she whispered, "Why do you care?" His hand paused for a heartbeat before resuming its gentle rhythm. "Because someone once cared for me when I didn't deserve it." Then silence again. But it wasn't empty. It was full of meaning too deep for words. When her fever finally broke, dawn was spilling over the ridge. She woke to find him dozing nearby, hat tipped low, the harmonica resting on his knee. His beard had grown rougher, his face drawn with sleepless lines. She realized then how long he'd stayed. Her throat burned as she whispered, "You should have let me die. Would have been easier." He opened his eyes slowly, studying her face as if memorizing proof of life. Easier's for the ones who've stopped fighting. You ain't one of them. By the time she could stand, the river was singing again. The air smelled clean after the storm. Cole handed her a canteen and said, almost too casually, "You're free to go." She froze. "What?" He met her gaze without flinching. "You came here to save your family. I'll keep my word. The sheriff won't touch them again. You have my mark on it." Her chest tightened. The world around her felt suddenly vast and empty. Freedom, the thing she had begged for, prayed for, now felt colder than the wind against her neck. "And if I stay?" she asked quietly. He turned away, adjusting his saddle. "Then you're no prisoner of mine." She stood there a long time, the decision heavy as the sky before rain. She could ride home. She could return to her mother's frail smile, her brother's fragile laughter. But every breath she took seemed to pull her back toward this man who said little but meant everything. As she mounted the small mare, she whispered, "I'll see them safe, then come back." He gave no reply, but as she turned to leave, the faintest sound reached her, the harmonica again, a slow tune carried by the wind. A melody that felt like both farewell and promise. That night, as the campfire faded behind me and the world turned silver with moonlight, I realized something simple and cruel. He had given me freedom, but my heart had already chosen its prison. And for the first time, I didn't want to escape. The wind changed before the trouble came. It always does. Even the horses felt it, restless, stamping, their ears flicking toward the east. Cole said nothing, but his hand hovered close to his gun, the way a man does when old ghosts start whispering through the dust. I had been gone 3 weeks, maybe 4. Long enough for the land to start knowing my name again. My mother had wept when she saw me. My brother had laughed his thin, wheezing laugh, and for a few quiet days, the world seemed merciful. But mercy is a brief visitor in the West. It never stays the night. One morning, a rider came. A stranger with a wound on his jaw and fear in his eyes. He handed me a note sealed with red wax, the kind a sheriff used for his lies. The words were few, scrawled in a cruel hand. "You're harboring an outlaw's promise. That makes you one of them. We're coming to burn what's left of your home." The paper trembled in my hand, not from fear, but from fury, a deep, wordless ache that tasted of iron and dust. By nightfall, I was already riding. The wind tore through my hair, the moonlight spilling across the desert like a river of ghosts. Every mile between me and Cole's camp felt like a heartbeat too long. When I reached the ridge, the firelight below glowed faint, steady, a signal of life I hadn't realized I needed. Cole was sitting by the same fire, hat low, carving a piece of wood into something unrecognizable. He looked up as I dismounted, his eyes finding mine like they'd been waiting there all along. "They're coming," I said. "The sheriff. With men. They'll burn everything. My mother, my brother." He didn't interrupt. Didn't ask how I knew. Just set the carving down beside the others. A small collection of unfinished shapes. Then he rose. "You told me once you'd trade yourself to save them," he said quietly. "Seems I owe you the same." The men gathered at dawn, faces drawn, rifles slung over shoulders. Cole gave his orders with calm precision, not as an outlaw thirsting for blood, but as a soldier preparing for a cause he didn't expect to survive. Some protested. "Ride there, and the law'll hang us all," one said. Cole's gaze cut through the smoke between them. "I'm not asking you to ride for me," he said. "I'm asking you to ride for her." Silence. Then one by one, they nodded, the way men do when they know their graves are already marked. The morning of the reckoning came with a sky the color of tarnished steel. The town of Marlow Ridge stood quiet, shutters drawn, streets empty. But under that stillness lay the promise of violence. The sheriff's men hidden behind barrels and windows, rifles gleaming like snakes in the sun. Cole rode beside me, calm as ever. His hat shadowed his face, but I saw the faint curve of his jaw, the muscle that twitched when he was thinking too hard. "Stay behind me," he murmured. I should have said no. Should have told him I'd already traded too much silence for men's wars. But my voice failed, so I rode beside him, not behind. When we reached the center of town, the sheriff stepped out from the doorway of the saloon, boots polished, badge gleaming, mouth curved in a preacher's smile. "Well," he said, "look what the wind blew back. The whore and her hound." The word stung, but I didn't flinch. Cole's hand hovered near his revolver, but he didn't draw. He spoke instead, voice low and clear. "You've had your revenge, Sheriff. Take what's yours, leave the rest. This land's seen enough burning." The sheriff laughed, the kind of laugh that carries no humor. "You think you can walk in here and talk law with me, outlaw? You've forgotten what justice looks like." Cole's reply came soft. "Justice never looked like you." The first shot came from the window to our left. A flash, a scream, the smell of gunpowder biting through the air. Chaos broke loose. Time splintered. I remember the sound of boots against wood, glass shattering, the horse beside me rearing. Cole's men fired back, covering the street in smoke and thunder. The sheriff shouted orders that no one could hear. I ran, not away, toward the only thing that mattered. My mother's house at the end of the road, where a trail of smoke already rose. The flames had caught the porch when I reached it. I kicked the door open, coughing through the heat. My brother was there, clutching his wooden toy horse, eyes wide with terror. I grabbed him, dragging him through the thick air, praying with every step that the roof would hold for just one more breath. When we burst outside, the sky itself seemed to be burning. Cole was there, bleeding from the shoulder, one knee on the ground, gun in hand. He looked at me like he'd found something worth dying for. The sheriff stepped forward through the smoke, his gun aimed straight at Cole's chest. "End of the road, west," he said, voice calm, almost gentle. "Lay it down." Cole didn't move, didn't raise his gun. He just said, almost to himself, "You think killing me makes you clean? It don't. You'll still wake up dirty." And then, before I could breathe, the sheriff pulled the trigger. The sound split the world. Cole staggered, the dust rising around him as he fell. My scream tore through the chaos, wordless, raw, ancient. I don't remember running, only that I was suddenly there, on my knees beside him, my hands pressing against the red blooming under his coat. His eyes were open, steady. "Don't cry," he whispered. "I'm still here." Gunfire still echoed down the street, but in that moment, everything else faded. The men, the noise, even the fear. There was only him. He coughed, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "You know, I thought freedom was running. Turns out it's just choosing who you'd bleed for." I pressed harder against his wound, shaking my head. "Don't talk like that. You're not dying. Not like this." His eyes softened, that rare, quiet look that had always said more than words. "You came to me a prisoner, but you were never mine to keep." The gunfire stopped. Smoke hung low, curling around us like a ghost reluctant to leave. The sheriff lay still somewhere behind, the town silent except for the crackle of burning wood. Cole's men gathered slowly, their faces grim but not broken. One of them knelt beside me, whispering, "He's alive. We'll get him back to camp. Don't you lose hope yet." I remember nodding, though my heart refused to believe. We left Marlow Ridge as the sun began to rise. Behind us, the flames devoured the sheriff's house, the church, the gallows. Every symbol of the false justice that had ruled this place. Ahead of us stretched open land, endless, raw, forgiving. Cole rode, slumped in the saddle, his head bowed, breath shallow. But he lived. Somehow he lived. And as we crossed the ridge where I'd first surrendered myself weeks ago, I realized something I hadn't before. The West doesn't take mercy easily, but sometimes it gives you a second chance when you've already buried your first. That morning, the sky burned brighter than any fire we left behind. Cole's blood still stained my hands. But my heart had never felt so clean. He had saved them all. My mother, my brother, even the town that once cursed his name. And in doing so, he had freed the ghost that had followed him all his life. The desert never forgets what it buries. Not bones, not blood, not love. It keeps them all, hidden beneath its golden silence, waiting for someone to remember. Weeks passed before the land softened again. The war in Marlow Ridge had burned itself out, leaving behind charred boards, cracked bells, and whispers that scattered like dry leaves. The sheriff's men vanished into their own shadows, and the townsfolk began to crawl from their hiding places, blinking at the light as if seeing the world anew. I stayed by Cole's side through every slow sunrise. We'd built a small shelter near the river bend, a place where the air smelled of sage and forgiveness. He'd been torn by the bullet, weak as a winter dawn, but every morning he'd insist on walking a few steps farther. You can't break a man who's already made peace with the end, he'd murmur, half smiling. Sometimes he'd sit outside, carving small figures from driftwood, a habit he'd never lost. One day I asked him why. He said, "So the hands don't forget how to make something that ain't meant for killing." Those days were tender, quiet, stitched together by little acts of care. The world had stopped rushing us, and we learned to live within the slowness. I'd wash his wounds while he read aloud from a weathered Bible, his voice cracked but steady. He'd try to hide the pain when he coughed, and I'd pretend not to notice. Some nights, we'd sit by the fire, the coyotes howling in the distance, the stars so bright they seemed to hum. He'd tell me stories about the land before men came to tame it, when rivers still ran wild and horses roamed free without fear of fences. And I'd tell him about my childhood, before debt and death had turned our hearts to stone. Somewhere in those slow evenings, love found its voice. Not the loud, foolish kind that burns quick, but the kind that grows from gratitude, from shared silence, from knowing someone has seen your worst and stayed. When Cole was strong enough to ride again, we returned to what was left of Marlow Ridge. It wasn't much, only bones of houses and fields half dead from neglect. But life, stubborn as always, had begun to creep back. Children chased tumbleweeds down the street. Women mended fences, singing old hymns. And for the first time in years, the church bell rang again, its tone cracked but still proud. The people greeted us not as outlaws or saviors, but as something simpler, as proof that even the dust remembers mercy. A woman handed me a loaf of bread. An old man tipped his hat and said, "Heard you both saved what was left of this place." Cole only smiled faintly, eyes far away. "Didn't save it," he said, "just gave a reason to keep breathing." One evening, as the sun melted into gold and crimson, I found him standing by the ridge, watching the horizon. The wind played with his hair, the light catching the faint scar across his jaw. "You ever think about leaving?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Every day, but I don't reckon the land would forgive me if I did." There was something in his tone, something final yet peaceful. I stepped closer, the hem of my dress brushing the dust. "Then maybe," I said, "we stay. Let the wind forget us here." He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw in his eyes the quiet surrender of a man who'd stopped running. Spring came shyly to the desert that year. Rain touched the earth in soft whispers, turning the ground dark and alive. Wildflowers bloomed along the riverbank, their colors trembling in the light. Cole spent his mornings helping rebuild the town stables, his arms still bound, but his spirit stronger than I'd ever seen. I taught the children letters and stories, tales of kindness and courage, not vengeance and guns. The West began to breathe again, and so did we. But peace, even in the gentlest hearts, is never without ghosts. Sometimes, I'd wake before dawn to find Cole sitting outside, staring into the distance, his hand clutching the wooden horse he'd carved for my brother. He'd never say what haunted him, but I knew. You can't wash away the blood of men you've buried, even if it was in the name of love. One night, a storm swept through the valley, thunder rolling like the memory of war. I woke to the sound of rain and found him standing in the doorway, rainwater streaming down his face like tears he'd never let fall. "You remember the first night we met?" he said softly. "You told me to take you as my prisoner." I nodded, the memory a ghost between us. "And you never did." He smiled, that tired, beautiful smile that always felt like home. "Didn't have to. You stayed." Days later, the fever came. Swift and cruel, like all things in the West. The wound that had healed on the outside had never mended within. By the third day, he could barely breathe, his eyes glassy, skin pale as smoke. I sat beside him, holding his hand, the night wrapped around us like a shroud. He turned his head slightly, his voice a whisper. "Don't mourn me, darling. I had more life in these last months than in all my years before." My tears fell onto his chest, mixing with the rhythm of his slowing heart. "Don't you leave me, Cole. Not yet." He smiled faintly. "You gave me peace, Mary. That's more than most men ever find." And then, with one last breath that felt like the sigh of the whole desert, he was gone. They buried him at dawn, beneath the wide sky he'd loved so much. The town came to pay their respects. Men who'd once feared him, women who'd once cursed his name. The preacher said a few words, but none of them were enough. When the others left, I stayed. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying his voice somewhere beyond the hills. I placed the little wooden horse beside his grave, my fingers trembling. "You're free now," I whispered. "But you always were." Years have passed since that morning. The scars on the land have softened. The town hums again with laughter and trade. Children play where blood once stained the dust. My brother has grown tall, my mother's hair silver as moonlight. And me? I tell stories now, by the fire, to anyone who will listen. Stories of mercy, of second chances, of how sometimes the fiercest man in the West was the gentlest soul you'd ever meet. They ask if it's true, if such love ever really lived. I smile and tell them the desert never lies. So if you ever ride through Marlow Ridge, and you see a lone grave by the river bend, tip your hat and listen to the wind. You might hear his voice there, steady, calm, unbroken, telling you that even in the wildest lands, there is a place for gentleness, a home for love, and forgiveness waiting beneath the dust. And if this story touched your heart tonight, leave a light in the comments below. Tell me where in this wide world you're listening from. Because stories like these, they don't belong to the West alone. They belong to every soul that's ever lost and still dared to love again.